reading through the Bible in a year in the one-year Bible, and today is July 13th already, Romans chapter 1, 18 through 32. So you remember how last time as we were looking at the beginning of Romans, we focused on the gospel, and this is where Paul begins and ultimately what he emphasizes. But for there to be a gospel, first the law must do its work on us and get us to come to the point where we despair of every form of self-righteousness. The law comes rather abruptly in Romans, and I believe that was Paul's intent. If God's righteousness has been revealed, so also has God's wrath. God's wrath from heaven is directed upon every expression of godlessness and unrighteousness done by people. Ungodliness, as Paul uses the term, is the absolute rejection of the existence of God. And with this rejection, there soon follows a dishonorable lifestyle. Paul observes that unrighteousness is literally everywhere among humanity. People actively initiate this ungodliness by actively opposing the truth. Now, Paul points out that people ought to have a natural knowledge of God based on nature. Remarkably, we can even see God's invisible qualities as we look at his created world. We ought to recognize God's eternal power and God's godness, his divinity. Both are plain to see. We don't even need God's word to recognize these things, God's power and his divinity. Nature has always revealed the truth about these invisible qualities and always will. Now, understanding that God is God and that he is powerful, it doesn't put you into a saving relationship with God, but just the same, you should know these things as self-evident. However, fewer and fewer people do that in our world today. Furthermore, the proper thing for us to do is to glorify and give thanks to God for his goodness given to us through creation, and yet it is increasingly rare to glorify and give thanks to God for his creation. Humanity's inexcusable refusal to glorify and give thanks to God has resulted in our worthless and darkened condition. This is our own doing as God's creatures. Simply put, people have also squandered the glory bestowed upon us at creation. We've devolved, if you will, into pagan idolatry in many cases and have exchanged the worship of God for the worship of man-made things. We've broken the first commandment and have made other so-called gods for ourselves. God's judgment is that he accepts this exchange and gives us over to the desires of our hearts. Some measure of this can be seen in the fact that sometimes people only learn to give up self-destructive behaviors once they are allowed to hit what is called rock bottom. What a terrible thing, though, that so many have exchanged the truth of God for the lies that we tell ourselves. Luther gave this definition: a God is that to which we look for all good and in which we find refuge in every time of need. Notice that Jesus, when he was tempted by Satan, affirmed the words of Deuteronomy 6:13, "You will worship the Lord your God, and you will serve him only." Then, as now, failing to worship is to fail. Next, Paul goes on to describe how we have exchanged the natural use of our very bodies created by God for our own use in ways that are contrary to nature. Paul, of course, has in mind all same-gender sexual relations. Of course, what Paul is talking about is not limited to this. We have, in very many ways, misused our own bodies, which are gifts of God. Once again, the divine consequence is that God gives us over to our own desires. Mercifully, then, Paul comes to the end here in this section of his list of sins. Though some of these sins might seem trivial or even outdated to our ears, greed and gossip are included too, as well as disregard for human authorities. But if sin ever seems trivial, it is only because of the downward, ever worsening spiral of sin itself. Paul's point is quite simply, sin is deserving of death. This verdict was rooted in Genesis 2. In the day you eat of it, you will surely die. Paul's final nail that he pounds into the coffin of sin is this: it is bad enough to do these things, but to think well of those who engage in these sinful practices is even worse, because that is openly and brazenly flaunting sin and providing temptation to others to engage in sin as well. And we've seen it in our present day world. Those who openly sin are often considered to be stars and celebrities, influencers, and even role models. May God grant us to know and understand and confess the truth of God's word, even in matters of the law, so that the gospel, with its forgiveness, may be turned to by as many as possible and believed. May God be with you and bless you, and I'll talk with you.